Welcome to this live webcast of Ask Chicago. I'm Alan Linton, doctoral student in political science, and I'm joined by Michael Dawson, the John D. MacArthur Distinguished Service Professor in Political Science, as well as the director of the Center for the Study of Race, Culture, and Politics. Professor Dawson has also published a new book, Not in Our Lifetimes, The Future of Black Politics, and we'll be having a nice Q&A with him over the next hour. And we encourage you all to submit questions via Twitter, our UChicago Twitter account with the hashtag of AskUChicago, as well as our Facebook account, facebook.com/UChicago, and the UChicago Live tab. Professor Dawson, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much, Alan.
First question, probably the most important question. Tell us about this new book.
It's a book that tries to make 3 points in general. One is that there's been a special moment in black politics for a few years, starting with the way I view it, the disaster that occurred after the Katrina hurricane, then with election in the first few years of the administration of Barack Obama. What's happened with black politics, what's happened with racial politics in the United States more generally, how do we continue to be divided by race? That's one theme. Second theme in the book is that I argue relatively strongly, I hope, that black politics remains weak in this country, particularly compared to 20th century black politics. It's unorganized, particularly at the regional and national levels, more than it has been in the past. We've had a relatively hard time influencing national debates over Katrina, over foreign policy, over a number of other key issues in American politics. And third, I talk a little bit about the future of black politics, or at least what we have to think about to move forward and to have a stronger influence in building democracy in the United States.
So our first question comes from Kiana Cox of Chicago, and she wants to know, in Black Visions, you talked about black feminism and the widespread black feminist ideology. How does black feminism play into black politics, some of the work in your book, and the future of black politics?
Well, black feminism, I think, for a number of reasons, is going to be an integral part of the future of black politics. Some of the leadership examples we know that we can see from black feminist movements in terms of collective, consensual leadership, I think, are the leadership models that black movements in general need to have in the future. On the other hand, I would also say that black feminism, much like progressive black politics in general, is not quite as visible or as organized as those of us who agree with black feminist politics would like to see at this time. So I think black progressive movements in general have to rebuild themselves. They've been an integral part of black politics for well over a century, but they're relatively weak right now. And to move black politics forward, we have to rebuild the progressive wing as well.
In your book, you really connect politics with the economy. And Philip Richards from Hampton, New York, wanted to know, what are the consequences of the recession, the economic downturn, and the eroding affirmative action policies on the black middle class and black people trying to succeed today?
Well, I think the recession has devastating consequences for the black community, like it does for most communities in the United States, except for maybe that 1% who is super rich. But in particular for the black community and the black middle class, we've seen two phenomena over the last 50, 60 years. One is the growth of the black middle class and becoming much more solidly entrenched in the overall American economy. We also seen the black middle class begins to move up into the upper level of elites, whether it's in the military with some, for example, General Powell as a good example, or in government with, of course, President Obama, but Secretary Rice are examples. We also see some major Fortune 500 companies have had black leadership. So we see a very small infiltration, is probably not the right word, of black presence in the highest levels. But the black middle class as a whole is still highly vulnerable. This recession is highlighting how vulnerable the black middle class is. On one hand, African Americans in the middle class did not participate in the stock market the way that other members of the middle class did. So African Americans started this recession with a deficit in wealth, and the fact that home values have been just devastated has disproportionately affected African Americans. Secondly, often members of the black middle class are in positions where they're easily laid off, whether they're in human resources or some other relatively soft form of employment. So we see unemployment levels in the black middle class rise. So many of the gains that have been made over the last half a century are being threatened. And of course, that's combined with a legal environment and political environment increasingly hostile to affirmative action. That said, I think the more devastating consequences have been for the black poor, where we're seeing larger and larger percentage of African Americans being disconnected from labor markets with very poor life chances in the future, and with some African Americans who were part of the workforce being laid off and having an extremely hard time becoming reemployed.
There's a disconnect between, at least the time from Katrina and the first couple of years of the Obama administration, between hope and the idea of hope and the reality of what's going on either economically, politically, and just day-to-day lives. And you really highlight that in your book. Can you just talk a little bit more about, you know, the distinguishing factors between hope and the political reality on the ground?
From the period, say, approximately the early 1990s through the Katrina disaster, African Americans had very little hope about the future of race relations in the United States. Our data shows that consistently. In fact, there was rising despair in the black community about the future well through 2005. And then we saw a stunning reversal with much larger percentage of African Americans, about half of African Americans all of a sudden becoming hopeful about the future. What we've seen, though, with the recession is over the last year is a reversal of the trend toward more optimism. So we're seeing a trend back toward a more of a connect between the problems that African Americans politically, economically, and socially face on the ground and their views about prospects for the future. So we're seeing a reversal in the optimism that marked 2008 and part of 2009.
Not to be stuck on the economy, but the Occupy protests have been big, certainly in Chicago, other major cities, and certainly on Wall Street. How are, you know, some of the themes there, you know, reflected for, you know, black political economy, black economy, and is there a sense of inclusiveness with black people and people of color in general?
Well, I think one aspect of the Occupy movement we should understand is that its character is very different in each of the cities. So in some cities it's more racially diverse and more diverse in terms of age, participation and the like. In other cities it's much less diverse. I don't think there's any purposeful exclusion at all, but what we've seen in the past is that there's been somewhat of a racial divide, whether we're talking about the suffrage movements a century ago, whether we're talking about the civil rights and anti-war movements, sometimes a little bit of a racial disconnect between different components of liberal and progressive movements in the United States. And I think in the beginning of the movements we're more likely to see that. What I hope, and I think what would be good, is to see many of the progressive currents, which are most visibly now reflected in the Occupy movement, become more diverse, more inclusive, and with more of a multifaceted conversation starting to be generated.
I want to remind people that we're talking about Professor Dawson's book, but also about presidential politics in general, the upcoming election, the state of black politics. One question that really struck me was from Jamie Dominguez via Facebook, the changing racial terrain with urban America and the growth of the Latino population. How does that, you know, map onto the trajectory of black politics? You talked about it in your book a little bit, but what's the new consensus?
Well, since 1965, there's been large waves of immigration, certainly from Latin America and also from Asia, but also from the Caribbean and Africa as well. So we have a diversity in both racial groups and ethnic groups within the black population, within the American population overall. This has monumental consequences for politics in the United States. This country, sometime this century, will become majority non-white. As of now, most of those populations are voting either overwhelmingly or moderately Democratic, so it could lead to a party realignment, as we don't like to talk about in political science. But what it also means is that the ideal that for black politics we have to find allies is driven home. In city after city, there's growing Latino and many cities growing Asian populations as well. For black political power to be effective, or for Latino political power to be effective, you have to have allies. And we have to start understanding the differences between political interests and try to work around those, find what are common interests and find a common language to unite around. That's proven more difficult in some regions of the country than others.
Where do some of the historically prevalent black organizations fit into the future of black politics?
I think that's yet to be determined, whether we're talking about organizations that have a long history of struggle for social justice like the NAACP or the SCLC, or which have focused on economic development like the National Urban League. I think there are several challenges those organizations face. One is to come up, like all of us need to, with some idea about what an socially just economic future looks like, a viable economic future looks for the country. A second disconnect, I think, with many black institutions, whether we're talking about the church or civil rights organizations, is to have a stronger connection with young African Americans. There's a very strong disconnect between, I think, the traditional organizations, whether it's sacred or secular, and the younger cohorts of black people. And three, I think they also have, to some degree, many of them, maybe not all of them, have to become much more comfortable with the use of technology, the new media, new information technologies. Those are critical for political mobilization, as we can see around the world and within the United States. I think some components of the black movement, more traditional components of the black movement, have been very slow to embrace and understand those technologies and their implications for political and social activism in the future.
Youth are a big group that use a lot of new media, but there's the digital divide. It's something that's very real. It's been talked about, for a long time. Is there a way of bridging this divide, and how is that hampering mobilization among black people in general, but certainly the youth?
Well, I think there's various digital divides. One is the lack of access for the lack of material resources to some forms of digital information sources and technology. Mostly people are talking about two types of deficits there. One is which communities are wired. Where do you have good cable access? Where do you have good access into the home for the internet? The other is, do people have access to their own personal computers? But on the other hand, there is also the fact that African Americans and other non-white communities use cell phones more than their white peers do. So there's there's interesting mix of technologies across communities. The other digital divide, though, has less to do with material resources and has everything to do with when you were socialized, about age. So young people are much more comfortable with new media, with social media of various types, with Net 2.0, than those of us who were socialized and became politically active in an earlier generation.
What's missing? You talked about black politics and the future of black politics being weak. What does it mean for black politics to be weak? How is it weak?
I think it's weak in multiple ways. I think some of the symptoms are the inability to influence national debates over key questions where the majority of African Americans have a strong view that is counter to the views of particularly white Americans. Katrina was a good example, but the war in Iraq and Afghanistan is another example where large majorities of blacks opposed the war even in 2003. Very early, as opposed to supporting the war, or what's the role of protest. Majority of blacks, I show from the data we have, thought that protest is a constitutionally protected form of political activity, but majority of white Americans think protest is unpatriotic. So there's very large differences about how blacks and some other groups in the country view the world, and blacks have been unsuccessful in entering those conversations, whether it's foreign policy, domestic policy, what have you. So, and I think part of the reasons African Americans have been unsuccessful either in influencing policy or political debate is that we don't have the strong independent black political organizations that we had a generation or two ago, or that we had throughout most of the 20th century. So rebuilding independent black political presence, strengthening the social institutions of the black community will be one way to rebuild black politics. That's again related to the economy. The economic basis for a lot of those organizations were various components of the black working class, unions, government employment, and we've seen those areas of the American economy either move offshore or just be severely cut back. So a lot of the economic base for the political and social institutions that were so critical to black politics in the past have been severely eroded.
How autonomous do you think these organizations need to be? There's a fear of co-opting some of these, losing legitimacy. Excuse me. How autonomous do you think these organizations need to be?
Well, I mean, I think there's a unfortunate habit in black movements that if you disagree with another black organization, they're clearly co-opted by somebody else. We see this a little bit with the candidate Herman Cain right now, where he's accusing the vast majority of African Americans of being brainwashed because they don't agree with his political or social agenda. That said, I think there's a balance that organizations have to strike between being able to cooperate with others, being able to compromise on one hand, and still being relatively autonomous. I think the one way to guard against that is that in the past we've had organizations that have had extraordinarily different viewpoints about politics, about economics, about social justice, about whether politics or economics should be emphasized, the role of the sacred. We have a wide variety of different types of organizations, and the danger that any one of them gets co-opted is somewhat attenuated.
We're always looking for more questions, so please keep sending them in at our UChicago Twitter account, hashtag AskUChicago. You mentioned Herman Cain, very politically active, certainly polarizing. Does he expect to get any black votes? And what about all of his popularity among white people? He's constantly polling high. What does he symbolize?
I think what Herman Cain symbolizes, one, is the general weakness of the Republican field for 2012. Several of the potentially strongest Republican candidates, Jeb Bush, Christie, Huckabee, have decided to sit this one out and most likely go for 2016. I think his success is also partly a reflection of the fact that others who appeal to evangelical, socially conservative voters have had their own problems. Think of Governor Perry and think of Representative Bachmann as examples there. But I also think that Cain is obviously striking some type of chord among the most conservative voters in the United States. He has a very straightforward message. He's very passionate about it. So I think that's part of the base of his success as well. Now, in terms of your first question about whether he's going to expect any black votes, he's not acting as if he expects any black votes. When you say that majority of a large constituency is brainwashed, you're not actually looking for favors from that constituency. I think he's using his attacks on African Americans as a way to legitimate himself among some conservative sectors of the polity. So no, I don't think he's expecting a lot of support from African Americans, and he has to get through a primary, and primary where there'll be virtually no African American presence anyway. So that's not his concern right now.
Earlier, you talked about how you found that most whites think that protest, certainly of the war, was unpatriotic compared to blacks. Why do you think that is? And can you talk about the historical roots of the importance of protests among the black community and how it could influence black politics going forward?
Generally, there's been, and I think it's somewhat understandable, going back to the early 20th century, to World War I, in fact, either a division within the black community about whether foreign wars are justified. There's big fights within among black leadership between people like A. Philip Randall and W.E.B. Du Bois about whether blacks should support American entry into World War I. That didn't happen during World War II for, I think, fairly obvious reason, given fascism in the U.S. But after World War II, there were large segments of the African American community, including at some points majorities against the war in Korea, the war in Vietnam. African American civil rights leaders came out against the war in Vietnam much earlier than other liberal leaders did, against intervention in places such as Grenada. I think part of that, there's been a tendency throughout the 20th century, and that has moved into this century, of identifying with non-white populations that are the places where military action sometimes occur. So there's been a strong anti-imperialist strain within black politics. I don't think we have that type of language anymore, but there is skepticism that remains in black communities about American intervening in various parts of what used to be called the Third World. There's also skepticism about whether, in black communities, given the history of government malfeasance in issues like Tuskegee, there's not an automatic belief that what the U.S. government does is just. And I think that in other American communities, there's still generally that belief that, particularly when it comes to foreign intervention, the United States is on the right side. African Americans don't always disagree, but they're much more prone to question that from the very beginning. I think that's why we see some of the differences. I think protests are slightly different. African Americans always have had to be loud, to make noise, to be heard often, whether it's protest or other forms of unconventional political activity, where I think many, as you know, political theorists and political leaders outside the black community find that to be disruptive and unjust and coercive. unnecessary in a just country, as some political theorists have argued. So I think that's where some of the differences on the suitability of protest in a democratic society such as the U.S. come from.
Now, the role of protests has certainly been very strong, and that history has been strong in Chicago. Representative William Dawson has certainly been an active person, at least when it comes to Chicago. Can you talk about a little bit of your family history and what you've seen and how you've interacted with politics?
My great uncle was a member of the Congress for over 30 years, representing a large district on the south side of Chicago. My father was a member of that political organization, and was also in politics himself until he retired a couple of decades ago. So my family on my father's side has been involved in Chicago Democratic machine politics, to be blunt, throughout my entire youth, from the time I was conscious politically at all to the time that I went away from college. On my mother's side, my grandfather in Cleveland was involved in not Democratic Party, excuse me, but in NAACP and protest politics. One of my aunts on my mother's sister was involved in radical organizing in the 1940s and 1950s. So we had lively conversations at dinner between what is sort of a left tradition, protest tradition on my mother's side of the family, and a machine Democrat tradition on my father's side. It meant that from a very early age I saw the world through a political lens. It also meant that politically I couldn't be active in Chicago for a couple of decades, because if people knew you were connected to the Dawson family, they made assumptions about what your politics were, which actually did not very much fit my own politics at the time. So, for example, my father's political organization was extraordinarily supportive of the Vietnam War. As a young college student during that period, I was opposed to the Vietnam War. As a Dawson in Chicago, nobody in the anti-war, the black left, would believe that a Dawson was against the war. So I did my political work in California, which is where I went to school.
And how has it in the future, informed your research agendas, this lens of politics from a very early age?
Well, I think what my background has provided is a few different things in terms of my own research. One is understanding that politics can take a number of different forms, material interests are a key central focus of politics, and can be used to mobilize people. But that there's an honorable protest tradition that needs to be active to hold the machine politicians accountable. I also realize that there's often a disconnect between what leaders want to do and what their constituents, whether we're talking about protest leaders or members of political parties, there's a disconnect there that we, both as citizens and as researchers in political science, need to better understand. That's how. Also, I was very active during the Black Power movement in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Why did progressive movements of that era finally die and in some senses fail? A lot of those questions still continue to motivate my research.
Great question from Twitter just came in from Daria Stegman. People talk a lot about post-racial attitudes among the millennials. I guess that's me. Do you see this, and what's the impact on the political landscape as we move towards a more majority-minority population?
I think some research that's been done at other universities, as well as research that Kathy Cohen, my colleague here, and others have done, suggests that there's perhaps less of a generational divide than we thought in 2008, but more still a racial divide. So even though a large number of young white people supported President Obama in 2008, unlike their African American and Latino counterparts, they did believe, or do believe, we live in a post-racial society where racism no longer plays a major role, where a majority of young black people still believe that race structures negatively the lives of non-white populations. It's an interesting divide that my research shows in Black, Latino, Asian American, and white communities, with In general, it can be said that whites are the most optimistic and most believe that we've already achieved a post-racial society, with blacks being the most skeptical.
Talking about politicians, post-racial society, Obama, for a lot of people, represented that. What about Obama and his handling of race has struck you? Certainly, people look at his iconic speech on race, but also others point to how he's tried to avoid the issue and how anytime the issue comes up in politics, it's a firestorm. Is there an effective way to accurately and seriously talk about race in the political sphere?
It's certainly very difficult for any politician to evoke race at the statewide or national level. We have example where that's been done to the detriment of candidates. And so it was clear that President Obama, as much as possible, or candidate Obama at the time, was trying to avoid discussions about race or to try to avoid the campaign becoming racialized, which is why I thought it was ludicrous and blogged that it was ludicrous when some of his opponents, liberal opponents, said that he was trying to play the race card. That was the last thing his campaign wanted. That said, at some points he couldn't avoid it, and what you saw was him trying to be even-handed. I understand the aspirations and difficulties and resentments in this community, and also understand the aspirations, resentments in other communities. We also know that when both conservative and liberal candidates for their party nominations for president, Senator Bradley and Jack Kemp, tried to have a civil debate about race, both of their parties turned on them. So I think the conventional wisdom is that type of civil debate, as opposed to trying to play the race card by evoking racial resentment, for example, is something we can't do. I think that if we're going to have a civil conversation about race, it's going to have to start at the local level. It's going to have to be outside the boundaries of party politics. It has to be something that we do in civil society. The political parties, it's not in their interest to have that debate, either political party.
When we're talking about racial differences, in your book you found a lot of differences between blacks and Latinos. How deep are some of those divides, and how are they impeding progress in terms of black politics or Latino politics?
There are some commonalities and some differences that I think we have to work through. We're talking about those type of coalitions in places like Los Angeles, Chicago, or New York, to use some prominent examples. Certainly in terms of respect to the economy, blacks and Latinos occupy roughly similar economic positions at groups within American society. Second is there are real differences over immigration policy between the two groups, with blacks having a more conservative view on immigration. African Americans, I think, large numbers of African Americans, not all African Americans, believe that Latino success, I think actually factually this is not true, comes at the expense of African American employment prospects. So that has to be worked through. On the other hand, some work that was done in various parts of the South shows that there is some, and also the work that William Julius Wilson has done, that is there's some suspicion, resentment, desire for exclusion on the part of Latinos of blacks from neighborhoods and from engaging in certain types of political discussions. This is certainly not the case universally. There's certainly been, for example, a long history of fruitful political alliances between black and Puerto Rican populations in large eastern and midwestern cities. But I think both groups have to understand that A, they have to work together, and B, they're going to have to come to some common ground on the issues that divide the groups at this point.
I guess looking forward, there are a lot of similarities, but a lot of different strong divides between blacks and whites. Some of the minor divides that's highlighted between blacks and Latinos. How deep are these racial divides? Are any of these going to close between these sets of populations?
I think the divides, which are sometimes quite substantial, sometimes not so substantial between, let's say, black, Latino, and Asian American communities, are very fluid, very amenable to political leadership, to what we call in political science framing, how arguments are framed can help overcome some of those divides. There are sets of common interests that we see among those groups around some issues, whether it's citizenship, standing, economic policies, the enforcement of anti-discrimination ordinances and legislation. So the divides are there, but there's all sorts of spaces for negotiation, debate, and coming together. The divides between blacks and whites are harder to bridge for two reasons. One, they have very long historical standing going back a couple hundred years. And two is that the way that the majority of whites and majority of blacks see the world is so different that sometimes we use the same language but don't mean the same thing. So there's a distrust that comes from misrecognition, to use again another phrase we sometimes see in political misrecognition of both the, I think both communities tend to see the other community as homogenous when they're not, neither is. So I think it's going to take a lot more work, a lot more political leadership, and a lot more time for those divides to be bridged. But given that at this point, most communities in this country, black, white, Asian American, Latino, Native American, are all suffering economically. Maybe we're in a situation where common interests will help to bridge those gaps more quickly than maybe we thought 2 years ago.
The race card being played. How are some Republicans playing on fears or members of the GOP in the GOP media? How do they, play the race card and continue to alienate and divide some of these historically different populations?
I think there's two or three ways that we see the race card being played. One is very recent. Ann Coulter, Rush Limbaugh, and others accusing the quote-unquote liberal media of unfairly attacking Herman Cain due to the questions that have arisen around charges of sexual harassment during the 1990s. That's the same type of sort of racial discourse, invoking of racial stereotypes, discredit questions of a black conservative candidate that we saw around the confirmation of Justice Thomas many years ago. Second is at the local level, not so much at the national level, we're seeing some really perverse use of the most racist images around the president, whether it's flyers talking about goats going to be eating at the White House being imported from Kenya, or the White House becoming the crack house, or other depictions of him as and his family as being apes. So we see a return to the type of negative racial images and stereotypes that many of us have thought have been banished from at least public American racial discourse. Third, I think there is attempts to try to use immigration issues as a way to mobilize blacks, for example, as well, and around an anti-immigration platform. So trying to stoke hostility toward Latino communities. So I think there's a lot of different ways that we're seeing the race card being played, particularly at the state and local level, but to some degree at the national level as well.
And on the left and Democratic media, how is race factored in, either playing the race card, or I know in the book you talked about some liberals doing whitewashing, trying to take race out of political conversations?
I think that we've seen, for example, around Hurricane Katrina, there were liberals and conservatives, including some on the left, who wanted to argue that the aftermath to Katrina, the government response, had nothing to do with race. And I consider that, as some lens in that chapter, to be an example of whitewashing, both the discourse and the politics around a crisis in American history and society. I think we also have seen in anti-war mobilizations, the most anti-war population in the United States is the African American community. So if you are against the war, I'm not saying one should or should not be, actually I do have a position which is in the book, but you would think that you would reach out to the black community. But we saw this during the Vietnam War too, where sometimes the communities that are most actively against a certain policy, the left ignores. I think we see that as well. But I think in general, particularly in terms of liberal and Democratic Party politics, a real desire to downplay race, a real fear of race coming up, being branded as being a black movement or the black political party, and thinking that's political death to be branded that way, so people run away from issues that are at all have a racial component to them.
Got another great question from Twitter from Brian Banks, an inner city business consultant. He wants to know, can you talk about the role of Chicago in national black politics?
But Chicago has always been, at least historically, at the center of national black politics for several different reasons. In the 20th century, it was one of the first cities to generate members to Congress. It was also, Chicago was the base for the generation of two members of African-American members of the Senate much later. It's also been a center of radical organizing in black communities, both black nationalism, the Nation of Islam is centered in Chicago, but also the black left have had historically strong influence in Chicago. You used to have monumental battles between African-American machine politics and African-American independents and African-American leftists and African-American nationalists. So the type of politics you saw occur, Chicago used to be one of the most organized, black community Chicago used to be one of the most organized black communities in the United States, and was often a trendsetter for national black politics. I think a little bit less so now, although I don't think it's a coincidence that President Obama comes out of Chicago politics, because to be successful in Chicago, to be successful in the state of Illinois, one, there's opportunity to do that, but B, you have to learn how to build the type of coalitions, do the type of fundraising that then translates well onto the national stage.
We'll always encourage more questions from Facebook and Twitter. If you want to send a question in via Twitter, send it to the UChicago Twitter account, #AskUChicago. Question, something I'm pretty personally interested in, speaking of Chicago, the idea of the changing black politician, a politician that is considered safe, someone that can play in the national media as well as local media. Can you talk about what is a safe politician and how has Chicago perhaps breeded some safe politicians?
Well, safe, I think, is considered by many to be pejorative. Yeah. But I think there's certainly a new black politician that we're seeing in Chicago and elsewhere, and seeing many examples of in Chicago. By safe, I think we generally mean a politician who may or may not try to help the disadvantaged, but who generally won't rock the boat and won't try to unsettle systems of power in either politically or economically. And in that context, it was often argued that William Dawson was a safe black politician. I think that was a fair assessment. He very much not only would not rock the boat, he would try to clamp down on protests with the black community or disruptive dissent within black communities. What I think we see today is a move away from the traditional black politician, the one who comes out of the civil rights or black power movements, who has a more radical economic agenda, who earned their stripes in those movements and then came up through the ranks of party politics, replaced with one that has a more elite educational background in general, much more technocratically and policy oriented, often who come out of either educational, if not education, out of business backgrounds, much less ties to traditional black organizations and institutions. And I think we see representatives of that new type of black politician. Well, we've seen them in Congress, but particularly from outside Chicago, but also inside of Chicago, we've seen members of the city council, state representatives, state senators who fit this younger, new cohort, differently situated type of black politician. Meantime, they're beginning to run against the older generation of black politicians, and we see differences in their support as well. The younger black politicians, at least in recent elections, have been more interested in reaching out to both the black middle class and to non-African Americans and perhaps some of their older competitors.
Question from Facebook, and I apologize if I ruined the name, but Hyacinth Lay Optimist, and I'm always an optimist, sent the question, can Professor Dawson speak to the heterogeneity of the black community? What impact are Caribbean and African blacks having in shaping political behavior, especially on the East Coast?
I think one of the most fascinating aspects of modern black politics that has been, not enough attention has been paid to, is the growing ethnic diversity among the black community, and that's most prominent on the East Coast in cities like Washington, D.C., New York, to use two prominent examples. One thing that we're seeing now in black politics on the East Coast and elsewhere that we've seen in Latino communities is ethnic conflict within a racial group. So we see, for example, Dominican, Jamaican, and quote-unquote traditional African-American communities compete for the same political resources, whether it's an elected office or other types of political goods. Secondly, I think it means that although there's always been a very large diversity of opinion within black communities about politics, we're getting new perspectives on foreign policy, more concern with attention on the parts of communities and politicians that represent those communities to parts of the world that maybe black communities were not as focused on in the past. So I think it means that we're going to once again have a more diverse black politics and have to become more familiar with a wider set of issues, a wider set of interests, and a wider set of perspectives than we had in the past. And I think that's only a good thing.
I have to ask about Cornel West and Tavis Smiley in terms of diverse opinions on accountability, what should be expected. How does that criticism, impact President Obama and how black people, perceive of the achievement of coming to office and accountability?
I think there's a minority of the black community, but one that was well established, that was suspicious or skeptical from both candidate Obama and President Obama. But I think that large numbers of that segment of the black community either silenced themselves and said, we'll give him a chance, or fell silenced by other African Americans, because there was such overwhelming support in black communities for the president. I think Tavis Smiley and Cornel West are not causing more opposition to the president, but I think they're reflecting skepticism and disappointment that is growing within the black community, and maybe making those who do have these criticisms feel safer or more empowered to make them themselves. So I think they represent a minority but growing segment of black political thought in this period.
In terms of organizing, both the president and, Cornel West, Tavis Smiley all talk about jobs. And Daria, on Twitter, again, thank you very much, talked about, ending some divides along racial lines and unifying on things like jobs, economic growth. How feasible is that? These are issues that have been around for a long time. The disparities have been very clear. Can we stop dividing on racial lines and more on economic divisions?
It's happened in the past. If there's smart organizing and goodwill, it can happen now. Certainly in Chicago, there were marches in the 1930s of thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of blacks and whites in support of more unemployment benefits in the middle of the Great Depression, and sometimes against police brutality. So we've seen that type of unity be built around economic issues in the past. It's difficult, but it can be done. It has been done. And there seems to be a prime opportunity to try to do it again.
And how would youth, a lot of youth going to college, black, white, Latino, having access to higher education, some of the new media you talked about, are they going to be the new leaders as new black politicians or politicians of color to lead this?
Well, I think that the youth, younger Americans across the board have to be the leaders. Every generation has to find its own leadership. They certainly can take advice or listen to the experiences of the past, but both for reasons of being more familiar, being more in tune with the problems of the times, and the technologies in this case of the times, you would hope, think, and expect that the key leadership has come from younger cohorts. And there's an interesting problem that we see in terms of younger college-educated Americans, which we've seen in countries like Italy over the last 30 years. Even the New York Times and other national papers are going to talk about the huge debt burden that college students are now routinely starting life with. And not just a debt burden, much declined prospects for getting jobs after graduating from college. So I think that although many young people across racial divides have access to college, they're facing a set of problems that are potentially quite dire if we don't come out of this recession very quickly.
Looking at, looking in the future of black politics, a lot of people would point to very strong differences between a Condoleezza Rice, a Colin Powell, and a Herman Cain, more moderate versus more conservative. Is this a reflection of just general partisan polarization, or is this something that is specific to how blacks can operate in politics, from left to right, that they have to shift over to more stronger partisan stances?
Well, I think that for the three people you named, I think they actually represent different aspects of black conservatism. Colin Powell could have run as a Democrat, which those who accuse him of being Republican in name only often made that made that charge. But in this case, with some justification, I think on many social issues and political issues, General Powell was quite liberal by today's standards, if not the past. So he represented a wing of the Republican Party that has almost disappeared, but people like Senator Jarvis from New York, Nelson Rockefeller once represented, and which had represented a very large segment of the black community, particularly the black middle class, from approximately 1920s through 1964. So that's one segment. Condoleezza Rice very much fits the profile of Reagan-era black conservative, conservative on economic issues, foreign policy issues, perhaps on some social issues, but that's not prominent in that configuration. But very savvy and able to manipulate and work within the channels of Washington, the Beltway, to be blunt. I think Herman Cain is different from either of those, with having virtually no experience in government, wasn't or in the bureaucracy, whether it's a military bureaucracy or State Department, as with Powell and Rice. Certainly running as an outsider, even though he was a lobbyist for a number of years, representing a fringe of the conservative movement. He's a little different, although there's a few black conservatives in almost any era that have that profile, although he's one of the few to run for office.
What does it take ultimately for a black conservative politician to win back, or for the Republican Party to win African American votes?
I think it takes a couple of changes. One is that the Republican Party would have to stop systematically stoking white racial resentment as a way to gain voters. African Americans are very attuned to that and will reject a party that engages in those type of tactics. Second, I think that any political party, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans at this point, have to come up with an economic program that African Americans find viable and that starts to begin to once again generate a good life for all Americans and not just a small group of Americans.
And for the left and the Democratic Party, usually historically very strong connection to the African American population. Is this something they take advantage of? Should they be worrying about losing some of that support?
I think it is something they take advantage of. They certainly, when you look at African American policy preferences, they're not reflected by and large in the legislative agenda of the Democratic Party. Blacks are to the left of the Democratic Party, and therefore the Democrats feel they have African Americans have nowhere else to go, so they can ignore in the minds of some Democratic Party officials that constituency. What I think they have to worry about is not so much a third-party threat or so much conversion to the Republican Party, but do blacks decide to stay home? If the Democratic Party wants to regain the Congress, if they don't want to see the Senate to go Republican, if they want to get a 60-vote safe majority in the Senate, if Barack Obama wants to be reelected president, you have to mobilize African Americans in those communities and not only have them vote overwhelmingly Democratic, but also have them come out in large numbers. Otherwise, states such as North Carolina, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, to use three examples of swing states with large African American populations, those populations don't come out. Democrats don't win those states.
One of the, troubles that I'm trying to figure out here is if the state and political structure is very not attuned to black politics and what black people want, but there's also a strong eroding of black politics and black community organizing. Where is the conversation and the growth of black politics going to happen? Where's it going to happen first?
Well, that's where we started. And that's why I think we have to rebuild independent, autonomous black politics, because you can't do that within the Democratic Party. I clearly believe you can't do it within the Republican Party. You have to be able to hold political parties accountable, politicians accountable, social institutions accountable, and we've always done that best when we have an independent black movement with multiple black organizations representing a wide range of political views. There's been other times in the past where the African American community has been politically down, economically marginalized, and those movements and those institutions were rebuilt. It's a hard process, but we need to do it again today.
The role of the church. How do you see the role of the church in terms of strengthening some of the community power of black populations, but also getting a more vocal and active stance in politics at large?
I think if you go back to the writings of Dr. Martin Luther King, I think what he said about the black church is true today, which is there's a progressive wing. There's a wing that will sit on the sidelines until forced by their congregants to get involved, and then there's a component of the black church that will try to oppose progress. At least that's how Dr. King would have defined progress at the time. What I think is that a mobilized black community needs the powerful arm of the black church to be part of that mobilization. But I think it's a two-way street in terms of holding individual ministers accountable and mobilizing within churches. At the same time, you're mobilizing, having a secular wing. Once again, African American politics has been at its most effective when it has a secular and sacred wing working together, sometimes in conflict. Generally, African American organizations have large levels of disagreement, but the church has always been part of that mix.
So our final question for this webcast: will race play an important role, and how will it shape the 2012 presidential election?
Race will play a major role in the 2012 election. Certainly to the degree that President Obama has to overcome a fair amount of disenchantment among the white community, to the degree that we're already seeing certain type of race baiting occur against the president. We had a very coarse political discourse that didn't border on race. It crossed the line into outright racism in 2008. I expect to have a fully negative campaign, both unofficially and officially again this time around. It's going to be complicated and in interesting ways I don't think we can fully foresee, by a debate about who's responsible for the economic crisis and who can best take us out of it. But yes, race is going to play a role in 2012.
Professor Dawson, author of Not in Our Lifetimes, The Future of Black Politics, thank you.
Thank you.
For taking
it's
time.
Fun.
Thank you for your questions, and hope to have you participate again in another live webcast of Ask You Chicago.